Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into one of the most unsettling chapters of medieval royalty, the long, suffocating decline of Frederick III, a king once feared by his entire court, yet eventually betrayed by his own body. Tonight's story follows the choking fits, the sudden bursts of rage, the bizarre rituals that spread through his palace, and the terror that crept like a silent plague through every cold stone corridor. This is not merely a tale of illness, it is a brutal reminder of how power can rot from within when placed in the hands of a man slowly slipping into the abyss. There was no war, no battle for succession, no foreign enemy. What made the kingdom tremble was nothing more than the king's wheezing breath, the way he failed to swallow even a single sip of water, and the fear that ignited like a hidden flame in the eyes of servants, courtiers, and visiting nobles. From a radiant spring banquet filled with candlelight, everything unraveled into endless nights haunted by the smell of medicine, pus, and dread, and a royal court suffocated by the downfall of a man no one dared speak of in a normal tone. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we begin, leave a comment telling me, which state in the United States are you watching from, and what time is it over there? I always feel something strangely comforting, knowing that someone is drifting into sleep in New York, Texas, Florida, or Washington, while someone else across the country is listening to this story in a completely different rhythm of the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Saliva from Marquis slid down the king's chin, and even a single attempt to swallow food turned him into a helpless creature at the banquet table. Chroniclers of the time made no effort to soften the truth. They recorded each detail with the cold precision of observers who knew that what they witnessed would shape the memory of a reign. Frederick III, a man born to sit at the highest peak of authority, now confronted an enemy that no army of his could destroy his own body. Every meal became a small ritual of torment, every sip the beginning of public humiliation, and from that moment onward, each day unfolded as an unending chain of choking fits, bouts of vomiting, rasping coughs, and the quiet contempt in the eyes of those who once knelt before his throne. Yet nothing began with illness alone. It began with humiliation, a single moment, sharp enough to break apart the royal dignity Frederick had tried so carefully to maintain. It happened during a spring feast in the year 1456, when the air was soft, the wine rich, and the nobility gathered beneath a vaulted stone ceiling, glowing with candlelight. It was the stage where royal authority was strongest, and it was here that the impossible happened. The king, speaking mid-sentence as he praised one of his courtiers, suddenly halted. In the midst of music and laughter, a silence fell abrupt, slicing, unnatural. His face tightened. His hand rose to his throat, stiff and trembling, like a man suddenly seized by an invisible grip. A small piece of meat, something harmless, something ordinary, lodged itself in his throat and transformed Frederick from a sovereign into a man struggling for his own breath. Those present froze, not out of loyalty, but from the shock of witnessing a humiliation no one knew how to respond to. Thick saliva spilled onto his robe. A streak of vomit spread across the expensive fabric embroidered with gold thread. Some guests turned away, others stole furtive glances full of secret satisfaction. Even the servants rushing toward him failed to hide the mixture of fear and disgust, twisting their faces. From that minute onward, Frederick stepped into another reality entirely. A world where death did not come from arrows or swords, but from the simple act of eating. A world where power no longer shielded him from shame, but amplified it, spreading it outward, echoing it across the hall. The shift was subtle, yet total. The king's body, once an emblem of authority, had become the source of his greatest vulnerability. He could feel it in the way the musicians hesitated before playing again. He could feel it in the way the courtiers whispered behind raised hands, pretending to fuss with their cloaks. He could feel it in the tightening of his own chest as he tried to compose himself, knowing the moment could not be undone. The spring feast of that year did not mark a change in politics or war. It marked the slow, suffocating collapse of a man whose body was beginning to betray him. And as he wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand, Frederick seemed to sense, though dimly, that the boundaries of his life had shifted. The throne, so solid beneath him, suddenly felt less like a symbol of permanence and more like a cold stone seat that offered no protection against the decay working its way through him. Even the air in the hall felt different, heavier, as though the entire court were holding its breath. From that day forward, every meal was approached with dread. Every goblet of wine, every spoonful of broth, became a test he feared he would fail. The king, who had once commanded fear with a gesture, now found himself terrified of the smallest tasks. And those who watched him began adjusting their postures, their voices, their very presences, as though an invisible line had been drawn between the king he had been and the king he was becoming. Nothing dramatic announced the beginning of his long decline. No battles, no enemies. Only a man, a piece of meat, a silent hall, and the first small crack in a reign that would crumble slowly, painfully, over the years that followed. It was in that moment that the true horror of his story opened like a doorway he could not step back from, a doorway that would swallow him whole. After that spring banquet, everything began slipping out of control. The first signs of the illness did not erupt violently. Instead, they crept in quietly, like tiny fissures spreading beneath the polished surface of royal dignity. Frederick III started with faint, dry coughs during meals. Then the coughs lengthened, deepened, turning into long spasms that halted conversations and froze the entire table in uneasy silence. Each time he tried to swallow, his throat produced a harsh, rasping sound, like a dull saw dragging through damp wood. It was a sound no monarch should ever have to make in front of his court. But there it was, echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings, uninvited, undeniable. Within a few weeks, the whispers began. Courtiers spoke softly, only when certain the heavy oak doors were shut. They murmured about a strange odour clinging to the king's chambers. It was not the crisp scent of medicinal herbs or incense that normally drifted through royal rooms. It was something thicker, heavier, a mixture of stale saliva pooling in the corners of his mouth, sweat that no longer evaporated but clung to the skin like damp cloth, and the faint metallic breath of a man afraid of his own body. No one dared confront him directly about it, yet everyone sensed it. The slow decay had started. His clothes, once symbols of spotless authority, began to betray him. Dark patches of saliva hardened along the embroidered trim. Bits of food clung to the threads. Sometimes, faint stains of vomit lingered where the fabric had not been fully cleaned. Still, no servant, advisor, or noblewoman mentioned it. Eyes lowered, heads bowed, everyone pretended not to see the undeniable signs of decline. The silence surrounding those stains was like a second skin covering the king, suffocating, invisible, inescapable. That silence sharpened Frederick's fear, and fear, in him, quickly transformed into irritability. A spoon polished imperfectly could provoke a glare that lasted far too long. A napkin placed slightly off-center on the table could summon a cold, trembling anger. Servants began to move like shadows, careful with every step, every sound, every breath. The king's suspicion grew like mold in the corners of the palace, slow at first, then unstoppable. At night, the castle changed. The corridors, once filled with voices, lute strings, and the soft shuffle of silk, now echoed only with Frederick's laboured breathing. He wandered, restless, his footsteps unsteady, his throat wheezing as though an invisible hand pressed gently, relentlessly against it. Sometimes he paused, one hand against the stone wall, eyes unfocused, as though listening to something only he could hear. Other times, sudden bursts of anger ruptured the stillness, followed by long stretches of hollow quiet that felt even more frightening. The royal household began to adapt without ever speaking of it. Meals grew shorter, conversations became thin and cautious. The staff trained themselves to anticipate his movements, his moods, the exact rhythm of his breathing. Even the courtiers who once delighted in gossiping, scheming, and flaunting their finery moved with muted steps, as though any noise might awaken something dangerous inside the king. The grand feasts that once defined the palace now felt like funerals for a world slipping away. Servants brought dishes with trembling hands, terrified that a single mistake might ignite one of his unpredictable tempers. Advisors watched the king's throat rather than his eyes, waiting for the next cough, the next choke, the next sign that his body was betraying him once again. The atmosphere thickened like winter fog, pressing down on every conversation, every ceremony, every breath. Many realized, though none dared say aloud, that this was not a passing sickness. It was the beginning of a transformation, slow, merciless, and irreversible. The king, who had once commanded armies and held nations in his grasp, was now fighting something much smaller, much quieter, yet infinitely more destructive. And in the silent dread that spread through the corridors, the courtiers understood a truth darker than any rumor they had ever whispered. This was only the beginning of something larger, heavier, and more frightening than they could yet imagine. By the autumn of 1457, Frederick's fear was no longer a fleeting sensation. It grew heavier, wider, stretching like a distorted shadow pulled long beneath the dim palace lamps. What had once been a vague suspicion now became a constant obsession, swelling like the tumor silently forming at his throat. Sometimes, just a fleeting glance from a courtier was enough to make him shiver, imagining treachery where there was none. A single soft cough behind him could make him whirl around, eyes dark-rimmed and wide with terror. And then, in a moment no one could have predicted, that fear finally burst. On a cold afternoon, as the last rays of daylight slid across the tiled courtyard, Frederick suddenly pointed at one of his trusted courtiers and declared that the man had plotted to poison him. No questioning, no investigation, no evidence. Only the king's hoarse voice, his laboured breath, and the ashen pallor consuming his face. Everyone present stood frozen, but that silence could not save the unfortunate man. The blade fell in a single sharp sweep of wind, and the head rolled across the stone floor like a grim omen for the entire court. Everyone understood. That day, the kingdom had crossed into a new era, one where truth held no value, and the fear of one man became the law for all. After the execution, meaningless rituals began to sprout like poisonous weeds. Frederick, trapped in the chaos of his own mind, issued commands no one dared refuse. Any red-haired girl passing through the palace gates was required to spit into his goblet, an absurd ritual he believed would purify his throat. No one knew why, no one dared ask. Each girl stepped forward with trembling hands, lowered eyes, and lips gone dry with dread. But they obeyed, because disobedience was far more frightening. The air inside the palace grew thicker day by day. The stone corridors seemed saturated with the king's odour, a sharp, rank mixture of rot, sweat, saliva, and the secretions leaking from his failing throat. Servants had to turn their faces slightly just to breathe, yet they were still forced to bow low and move slowly. Any hint of discomfort, any wrinkle of the nose, might cost them their life. Frederick's gaze, though clouded by illness, still cut through the hall like a blade. His meals, once symbols of royal power, became disturbing rituals no one wanted to witness. Before him lay only thin broths, crushed herbs, and salty concoctions nearly impossible to swallow. Yet every spoonful made his throat spasm, the wheezing sound long and ragged. Sometimes he choked so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. Sometimes the broth rose back up, mixed with phlegm, spilling down his robes, while the servants stepped backward in terror, waiting for another burst of rage. The palace gradually transformed into an invisible prison. No one wished to enter his chambers. No one wished to bring food, replace his linens, or clean the traces he left behind. People avoided each other's eyes, avoided footsteps, avoided even the slightest chance of being chosen to serve at his meals. Doors stayed shut. Conversations dwindled to whispers, then disappeared entirely. And the most terrifying thing was this. No one dared sigh. No one dared complain. No one dared meet anyone's gaze, not even for a heartbeat. Loneliness became Frederick's only companion. Loneliness in the suffocating nights. Loneliness in the rasping breath that filled the hallways. Loneliness in the silence that stretched like winter fog across the entire palace. And slowly, piece by piece, the illness of a single man began to expand into a darkness that engulfed the whole kingdom. A kingdom ruled not by strength, but by terror, swallowing everything in its path. The winter of the year 1459 marked a turning point that chilled the entire palace to the bone. A young girl of only 18 years, carrying a bundle of clean linens, stepped quietly into the king's chambers. She had been warned not to make noise. She had been told to keep her eyes lowered. Yet none of those instructions could prepare her for the sound that erupted from Frederick's throat, a wet, ragged, animalistic cough that tore through the silence like a blade. Startled, she dropped the towels. They fell softly against the stone floor. But the soft sound was enough. Just one sound, just one reflex of fear, and within a few brief seconds, Frederick wrapped his hands around her neck and squeezed until her body went limp. Her death was hidden, but the palace walls carried secrets as efficiently as wind carries snow. Within 24 hours, every servant and courtier understood what had happened. From that moment onward, no one dared enter the king's chambers unless forced by threat of punishment. Those who stepped inside did so as if approaching a wild beast cornered in its lair. Not a monarch, not a ruler, but something feral and unpredictable, driven by pain and terror rather than reason. It was also during this time that the swelling at Frederick's throat became impossible to ignore. A large, rounded mass had formed, dark beneath the skin, pressing outward in a way that distorted the lines of his jaw. Whenever he bent forward, the swelling seemed to pulse, as though responding to an unseen heartbeat. Servants who stood close enough reported hearing faint, wet movements, a sound like thick liquid being stirred, or bubbles rising through mud. They exchanged terrified glances but kept their lips sealed, understanding that even a whisper could end their lives. By now, no solid food could pass through Frederick's throat. The mere attempt sent him into choking fits so violent that he clawed at his own neck, leaving scratches that oozed and crusted over. The royal physicians, powerless yet desperate, inserted a narrow feeding tube and forced liquid mixtures into him, salty broths, crushed herbs, and gritty medicinal infusions. Each time the tube touched the inflamed interior of his throat, blood and saliva spilled out, running in thin, red-tinged streams down his chin and soaking into his robes. Frederick often tore the tube out himself. In his frenzied attempts to pull it free, he scraped the inside of his mouth until deep grooves split across his lips. The taste of blood mixed with the bitterness of the concoctions, and the floor of his chamber was marked with dark stains from the droplets that fell as he staggered across the room. Yet no physician dared restrain him. No one dared intervene. The king's fury had grown too large, too unpredictable. Instead, they watched from a distance, their hands trembling around bowls of ointments that could no longer offer relief. His suspicion extended to the kitchens. Frederick replaced his cooks again and again, sometimes twice in a single week, convinced that each of them plotted to poison him. Bowls of broth were thrown across the hall, cups were smashed against the stone walls, burning candlesticks were hurled at servants who could not escape quickly enough. The clang of metal, the echo of shattering glass, and the muffled cries of pain became part of the castle's nightly rhythm. The court itself descended into a distorted silence. Laughter vanished. Music disappeared. Feasts no longer existed. The only sounds that remained were Frederick's wheezing breath, the dragging of his feet as he paced through the corridors, and the chilling pronouncements he issued in moments of rage. A servant who sneezed was flogged. A maid who trembled was accused of disloyalty. A guard who glanced too long at the growing tumour on the king's neck was thrown into the dungeon. Everyone understood. They had crossed into a landscape shaped entirely by fear. A place where one man's collapsing body had become the gravitational centre of an entire kingdom's misery. There was no returning to normalcy, no path back to the order that once held the palace together. They were moving deeper step by silent step into a nightmare that spread like frost, creeping under doors, settling into bones, and tightening its grip with every passing day. During a desperate attempt to regain control over the invisible hands tightening around his throat, Frederick issued decrees that pushed the court beyond the borders of reason. By the early days of winter, in the year 1460, he declared that every solid, food, bread, meat, fish, even the softest loaf, was forbidden throughout the entire palace. Nothing with texture was allowed to cross any doorway. Even visiting dignitaries, who had travelled weeks through wind and frost, were forced to sit at the king's table and pretend to enjoy bowls of watery gruel, thin herb mixtures, and salty broths. The sight of nobles in fine velvet, silently lifting spoons of greyish liquid to their lips, became one of the palace's new, humiliating rituals. Frederick believed that eliminating solid food would remove the threat lurking in his throat, but it only deepened the atmosphere of suffocation that hung in every corridor. And then came his next decree, stranger, darker, stitched together from fear rather than logic. Anyone stepping into the great hall was required to wear a ribbon of bright red tied tightly around the neck. Frederick claimed it symbolized shared royal suffering, as if pain could be distributed like a tax. The court obeyed. Red bands covered every throat, from the youngest page to the oldest advisor. Seen from afar, the hall resembled an endless funeral procession, a macabre parade where no one dared breathe too loudly. But even that was not enough to soothe the king's rising terror. One bitter winter day, two courtiers made the simple mistake of walking too close to the doors of Frederick's chambers. Their footsteps echoed, barely audible, barely real, but to the king's fraying mind, it sounded like the scuttle of assassins. He staggered out, trembling and enraged, clutching a bowl of hot soup. Without warning, he hurled the boiling liquid at them, the broth splashing across their faces, causing burns that blistered instantly. Before they could even scream, he ordered the guards to drag them to the dungeon for conspiracy against the crown. No trial, no inquiry, no hesitation, and no one dared argue. The few who witnessed the scene lowered their eyes, pretending not to have seen anything, because acknowledging it meant becoming a part of the king's madness, and that meant risking death. In that suffocating silence, even the simplest human sounds became dangerous. A cough in the corridor, a sneeze during supper, a throat clearing during an audience. Each was interpreted as disrespect, or worse, a coded signal of treachery. Servants who once chatted quietly while polishing silver now moved like ghosts, inhaling carefully, terrified of letting a sound escape their lungs. The palace, once full of music and footsteps, became a mausoleum of breath and fear. As the days turned colder, pieces of Frederick's sanity slipped away like snow disappearing under a weak sun. His suspicion grew sharper, heavier, more suffocating than the tumor swelling in his neck. He studied every gesture of those around him, the way someone held a cup, the tremor in a servant's hand, the flick of an advisor's eyes, as if each movement was a hidden blade aimed at his life. Conversations shrank to whispers. Whispers shrank to silence. And silence became the rule of survival. Frederick's paranoia infected the palace like a slow-moving plague. Guards patrolled with rigid posture, afraid that a single mistake could cost them their lives. Pages walked with their chins tucked into their chests. Cooks trembled while preparing thin broths, fearing that the slightest grain of spice or change in temperature would lead to accusations of attempted murder. Even the physicians, those who should have been closest to the king, kept their distance when possible, terrified that being near him meant being blamed for the agony he could no longer escape. Violence no longer came in sudden storms. It settled in like winter fog, constant, cold, and impossible to outrun. What had once been outbursts now formed a pattern. Frederick's rage became predictable in its unpredictability, woven into the fabric of each day. A misaligned goblet could spark an eruption. A servant's trembling hand could unleash fury. A moment of hesitation could bring punishment. Fear became the architecture of the palace. It coated the walls thicker than dust. It echoed in the steps no one dared take. It pulsed beneath the red ribbons, tied at every throat. And slowly, steadily, unavoidably, the court understood that they were not witnessing the collapse of a king, they were living inside it. By the autumn of 1459, Frederick's fear was no longer a passing feeling. It grew heavier, darker, stretching across his days like a warped shadow under a dying lamp. What had once been a vague suspicion hardened into a constant obsession, swelling just like the tumor quietly forming in his throat. Sometimes, just a fleeting glance from a courtier was enough to make him shiver, imagining treachery. A single soft cough behind him could make him whirl around, his hollow eyes widening in panic. And then, in a moment no one could have predicted, that fear erupted. On a cold afternoon, as the last sunlight spilled across the stone courtyard, Frederick suddenly pointed at a trusted attendant and declared that he had attempted to poison him. No questioning, no inquiry, no evidence. Only the king's rasping voice, his laboured breath, and his pale, trembling face. Everyone present froze in stunned silence. But silence could not save the doomed man. The blade fell through the air with a sharp whisper, and the head rolled across the cold stone like an omen for the entire court. In that moment, everyone understood. The realm had crossed into a new era, one where truth held no value, and one man's terror became the law over all. After that execution, meaningless rituals sprouted like poisonous weeds. Frederick, lost in his own unravelling mind, issued commands no one dared oppose. Any red-haired girl entering the palace had to spit into his goblet some twisted ritual meant to cleanse his throat. No one understood the reason. No one dared ask. Each girl approached with trembling hands, lowered eyes, and lips dry with fear. But they complied, because not complying was far more dangerous. The air inside the palace grew thick and heavy. The cold stone corridors absorbed the sour, rotting smell that clung to the king's body an acrid mixture of sweat, saliva, and the fluids seeping from his failing throat. Servants had to turn their faces slightly to breathe, yet they still bowed low, careful never to betray discomfort. One wrong expression, one stray glance, might cost them their lives. Frederick's gaze, cloudy with illness, still cut through the room like a blade. His meals, once grand displays of royal power, became grotesque rituals no one wished to witness. Before him sat only thin broth, crushed herbs, and salty mixtures nearly impossible to swallow. Yet every spoonful made his throat seize, producing long, jagged wheezes. Sometimes he choked so violently that he clutched the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. Sometimes the broth flowed back up, mixed with mucus, sliding down his robes while servants stepped back in terror of triggering another sudden rage. Bit by bit, the palace became an invisible prison. No one wanted to enter his chamber, no one wanted to bring food, replace linens, or remove the blood-stained cloths he left behind. People avoided each other's eyes, avoided being seen, avoided even the possibility of being chosen to serve the king. Doors shut, conversations faded to nothing, and the most frightening truth was that no one dared sigh, no one dared complain, no one dared look directly at another person for even a moment. Loneliness settled beside Frederick like a permanent companion. Loneliness in the dark, loneliness in the wheezing breaths, loneliness in the suffocating silence that hung over the palace like winter fog. And piece by piece, the illness of one man began to swell into a shadow that engulfed the entire kingdom. A kingdom ruled not by strength, but by the crushing terror that seeped into every corner of daily life. The year 1460 marked the arrival of a new terror, one that did not shout, did not announce itself, but rose slowly beneath the king's skin like a warning whispered straight from the darkness. At first it appeared only as a faint, circular bruise below Frederick's jawline, a shadow that could have been dismissed as a trick of lamplight. But day after day, it darkened. Week after week, it grew. What began as a blemish hardened into a swelling, round and heavy, as if a stone had lodged itself deep within his throat. By mid-year, the discoloration had turned almost black, bruised and sinister, and the surface pulsed in a way no human flesh should have moved. Servants swore in voices barely above a breath that at night they heard a soft, wet sound coming from it. A sound like thick liquid being stirred, or like bubbles rising through mud. They avoided speaking of it, because even whispering carried the risk of being heard. But among themselves, in the deepest corners of the castle, they agreed. The swelling behaved as though it had a life of its own. Whenever Frederick bent forward, the mass seemed to throb violently. His breath would seize, then tear out of him in a high, ragged wheeze that echoed off the stone walls. Every attempt at swallowing, even the thinnest broth, sent pain flashing across his features. He pressed his fingers against the lump, as though trying to steady it, to push it back, to silence whatever restless thing might have been trapped inside. Month by month, Frederick's face reshaped itself into something unrecognizable. His cheeks hollowed until his bones appeared sharpened beneath his skin. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, sank deeper, ringed with shadows that never lifted. The color of his skin shifted toward an ashen blue-gray, the hue of someone caught between the world of the living and something colder. His lips, always slightly parted now, had taken on a dark violet tint, as if each breath cost him more than a king should ever have to pay. Meals became a ritual of dread. Only bowls of thin porridge remained, mixtures so watery they barely held color, yet even these brought him to the brink of suffocation. The moment a spoon brushed his tongue, the muscles in his throat spasmed. His entire body jerked forward, and the porridge spilled out again, mixed with strands of saliva and streaks of blood. It slid down his neck, seeped into the folds of his collar, and dried there in thick, ugly lines. The odor inside his chamber grew heavy, dense, almost oily, a suffocating blend of rot, sweat, pus, and damp linen that clung to anyone who stepped inside. Most servants no longer crossed the threshold willingly. Those assigned to him moved as though walking into a crypt, swallowing back nausea and dread with each step. Those who could not bear it begged to be reassigned. But Frederick's paranoia made petitions dangerous. And so the castle adopted a routine of silent suffering. Dirty cloths piled in corners. Bowls of half-eaten broth gathered flies. Bedding stiffened under the weight of dried secretions. No one dared disturb the mess unless directly commanded. Even the highest courtiers kept their distance. Their silk shoes no longer clicked confidently along the polished floors, but shuffled hesitantly, as if noise itself might offend the air. Conversations died wherever Frederick walked. The king's affliction had broken free of his body. It had spilled outward, infecting the rhythm of the entire palace. Every breath he drew, every choking gasp, every strained swallow became a reminder that death lived among them, patient and watchful. As rumors spread that the swelling beneath his jaw was not an illness but a punishment, fear took on a shape of its own. Some whispered that it was a curse, a physical manifestation of the kingdom's sins. Others said it was a creature, a parasite of divine origin, gnawing its way through the king's throat as retribution. No one dared voice these beliefs openly, yet even the most pragmatic advisers avoided looking directly at Frederick's neck. The movement beneath the skin was too unnatural, too rhythmic, too alive. By late autumn, the castle felt less like a seat of power and more like a mausoleum awaiting its final resident. The monarch still breathed, still commanded, still lived, but the sickness had already carved its dominion through every stone and every soul. And as the swelling continued its slow, pulsing rise, the court understood an unspoken truth. Whatever consumed Frederick was no longer content with him alone. By the year 1460, a strange and unsettling swelling began to rise beneath the skin of Frederick's neck. At first it was only a dark, circular bruise, but each week it grew larger, darker, and more distorted, pulsing, faintly as if something inside it was shifting of its own accord. The servants swore that, on certain nights, they heard a wet, sloshing sound coming from the mass, like the murmur of stirred liquid. Whenever the king bent forward, the swelling throbbed violently, pulling his breath into a sharp, wheezing whistle that echoed painfully through the chamber. Frederick's face began to change with each passing month. His eyes sank deeper into their sockets, surrounded by hollow shadows. His skin faded into a dull, ashen grey, the colour of winter stone. His lips turned a permanent shade of bruised purple, always slightly parted as he tried endlessly, helplessly, to draw in more air. His meals had been reduced to the thinnest broths, barely more than salted water. Yet even these meagre, softened portions often sent him into fits of choking, leaving strands of saliva, flecks of blood, and bits of food trailing down the collar of his gown. The smell inside his chamber grew so heavy that one did not need to enter the room to feel sick. Standing near the door was enough to turn the stomach. It was the stench of decay, of stale breath, of infected flesh slowly surrendering to time. No tapestry, no perfumed brazier, no open window could drive it away. The courtiers drifted apart, moving around him like ghosts terrified of touching a living flame. None dared flee the palace. Fear of the king's wrath weighed just as much as fear of the disease itself. Every whispered conversation became shorter, quieter, as if even sound might provoke his anger. Servants avoided crossing paths with one another, always frightened that their footsteps might be overheard and misinterpreted. By this time, the king's illness had escaped the boundaries of his own body. It seeped into the walls, into the corridors, into the minds of all who served him. It altered the rhythm of the palace, bending every routine into a kind of ritual dread. People began to say, in trembling voices they barely recognized as their own, that the swelling on Frederick's neck was not an illness at all. It was a punishment sent from above, a silent creature feeding on him day by day and through him, consuming the entire kingdom. They whispered that the mass pulsing beneath his skin was the shape of doom itself, a dark omen given form. Every time Frederick choked, the courtiers felt their own breath tighten. Every time he gasped for air, the palace felt the walls shrink inward. His sickness was no longer a private suffering. It had become a shadow cast across the throne, growing longer and heavier with each season. And so, as the year 1460 unfolded, the royal court found itself trapped inside a nightmare that no one dared name aloud. The king was still alive, but the kingdom felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to arrive. And deep inside Frederick's throat, beneath that throbbing, darkened swelling, the sound of slow, wet movement seemed to promise that the worst had not yet begun. By the year 1461, the turmoil within Frederick's mind no longer stayed confined to the silent chambers of the palace. It drifted outward, spreading into the villages, the courtyards, and the lives of those who had never even seen the king's face. Each time a wave of choking struck him, Each time his breath caught in his swollen throat and produced that strained, rasping sound, Frederick felt certain that someone, somewhere, was whispering against him. The suspicion grew slowly at first, like a faint echo, then swelled until it filled every hour of the day with dread. To him, a murmur in the corridor was no longer a simple conversation, it was evidence. A cough behind a curtain was not an accident, it was condemnation. Rumours about the odour lingering around the king's chamber reached the countryside. Harmless comments, spoken quietly between villagers, travelled back to Frederick through frightened servants, and once those whispers reached him, they hardened into beliefs. He became convinced that mockery lay hidden in every tone, that unseen voices were placing invisible curses upon him. His orders, once grounded in some semblance of royal logic, began drifting into new, troubling territory. There were nights when royal guards were dispatched to distant settlements, tasked with quelling what Frederick believed to be coordinated disrespect. Families were removed from their homes in silence, entire households escorted away under the pretext of investigations. Official proclamations later stated that illness had struck those regions, but everyone knew it was the king's fear thick as winter fog that had swallowed them. In the village of Kencht, 8 families disappeared over the course of one cold night. Their houses stood quiet for months afterward, doors left ajar as if someone might return, though no one ever did. Inside the palace, the atmosphere changed further still. Daily life twisted into something fragile, brittle, easily shattered by the smallest misstep. A misplaced cloth, a meal that tasted slightly different from the previous evening, or even footsteps that seemed too loud against the stone floor, could be interpreted as disrespect or hidden defiance. Courtiers learned to move with slow, measured care, as though the air itself might turn against them. Conversations faded into whispers. Laughter, once a common sound, became something people avoided instinctively, as if joy itself were forbidden. The punishments Frederick ordered no longer came with lengthy accusations or formal hearings. They emerged suddenly, fueled by the king's unsteady breathing and worsening paranoia. Servants who once bustled confidently through the halls now walked with lowered heads, adjusting their gait so that their shoes made no sound. Every gesture became calculated, every breath felt monitored. The palace, which had once been a symbol of grandeur, transformed into a quiet labyrinth, where even the shadows seemed apprehensive. Those closest to Frederick, advisors, attendants, healers, retreated into silence. Some limited their visits to the absolute necessities, others found excuses to remain in distant wings of the residence. The king's presence no longer inspired awe or reverence. It inspired caution, as if merely being noticed by him might alter the course of one's life. His illness, once viewed as a private misfortune, evolved into a force that governed the rhythm of the entire court. As Frederick's suspicion deepened, a strange shift occurred in the collective spirit of the palace. People stopped speaking of hope. They stopped predicting improvements. Instead, they watched the king's decline with a quiet resignation, understanding that his condition had grown into something larger than any physician could treat. The nation was no longer ruled by a monarch, but by the unpredictable tides of his illness. Decisions were made according to his anxieties. Policies emerged from his sleepless nights. Silence became the only safe response. Across the kingdom, the same mood seeped into the villages. Travellers who approached the capital commented on how the air felt heavier the closer they came, as if the fear within the palace walls extended outward in waves. Merchants lowered their voices when mentioning the king. Mothers urged their children not to repeat stories they heard. Even the clergy, who typically offered explanations rooted in faith, found themselves avoiding any public interpretation of Frederick's suffering. It was safer not to speak at all. By the end of that year, joy had evaporated from the royal residence entirely. Celebrations were postponed indefinitely. Festivals were cancelled. Music, once a staple of every gathering, vanished from the halls. Only the rhythmic sound of Frederick's strained breathing drifted through the corridors at night, mingling with the faint clatter of distant armor and the muted shuffling of servants trying not to be heard. People no longer waited for the situation to improve. They simply endured it. The kingdom had entered a new era, one shaped not by war, diplomacy, or foreign threat, but by the slow unraveling of a single man. His illness had grown into an unseen ruler, imposing a rule of tension, caution, and dread. And though no one dared speak it aloud, everyone understood the truth. The kingdom was being governed by fear. not by the hand that wore the crown. By the summer of 1461, the palace had transformed into something unrecognizable, a place stripped of every sound that once gave it life. The music that used to echo beneath the vaulted ceilings was gone. The chatter of courtiers, once bustling like a river at dawn, faded into nothing. Even laughter, once the soft background hum of long evenings, had vanished entirely, as if the walls themselves had swallowed it. Those who had lost family members because of Frederick's ever more erratic decrees drifted through the corridors like shadows, their faces hollow, their steps feather-light, as if each footfall might awaken something dangerous. Everyone moved carefully, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and even then, in whispers so faint that the stone barely carried them. The silence was no longer an absence of noise, it had its own weight, a density that pressed against the ribs, a constant reminder that the king's illness had grown beyond his body. It had seeped into the very structure of the kingdom. What began as Frederick's private torment had become an invisible wound stretching across the land, and no healer, no counsel, no prayer could mend it. Even his sons, once close enough to stand at his side without fear, now approached only when the situation left them no choice. They paused at the threshold before stepping into his chambers, as if crossing into a different realm, one ruled by breathlessness, by suspicion, by the faint, wet rattling that came from Frederick's throat. They kept their eyes lowered, careful not to glance at the swelling that distorted his neck. No one dared to breathe too loudly. No one dared to shift their weight or stir their clothing. In this room, even the smallest sound felt intrusive. The advisors who had once shaped policies, settled disputes, and guided the affairs of the kingdom, now stood in a rigid line whenever summoned. They feared the tremor of their own voices, worried that a single unsteady breath could be misheard as defiance. The king's gaze, unfocused yet sharp in its unpredictability, swept the room slowly, as if marking every pulse, every twitch, every blink. Some advisors closed their eyes for a heartbeat, not out of disrespect, but out of a desperate attempt to steady themselves. None of them believed Frederick would recover. None of them believed the man who once ruled with clarity still existed beneath the layers of pain clouding his mind. Outside the chambers, life disintegrated into ritualized stillness. Servants learned to drift from task to task, with a kind of practiced invisibility. They folded linens silently. They carried bowls of broth in careful hands, the liquid barely rippling. Doors were opened with gentle movements, closed with a slow exhale. Even the torches lining the walls seemed to burn more quietly, their flames small and trembling, as if fearing to disturb the air. The gardens, once tended with pride, grew unchecked. The fountains, once gleaming, now murmured faintly beneath layers of moss. It felt as though the palace itself had stopped breathing, waiting for something, anything to break the tension, but nothing did. Instead, every day mirrored the last, a repetition of hushed steps, tight throats, and glances filled with unspoken dread. Rumours passed quietly from servant to servant, murmured behind sleeves and half-closed doors. Some said the king no longer slept at all, merely slumped into brief spells of exhaustion that resembled rest. Others insisted they heard him pacing at night, his breath shallow, his steps uneven, as though he was searching for a way out of his own body. Those who had stood close enough to hear described the sound coming from his throat. Not quite a wheeze, not quite a gasp, but something caught between the two, a sound that made them shiver long after they stepped away. In the great hall, the red ribbons that Frederick had once demanded everyone wear still hung around the necks of courtiers. They moved like muted reminders of the king's despair, fluttering gently whenever someone passed by. Once, the hall had shone with gold embroidery and vibrant banners. Now, the red bands gave it the solemn air of a procession that never ended. Some courtiers tugged at them unconsciously, as if trying to loosen a pressure that wasn't truly there, a pressure that lived instead in the mind. By midsummer, no one pretended to hope for a turnaround. Whispers of recovery or improvement had died out months before. The idea of a miraculous change belonged to legends, not to the corridors weighed down by the king's illness. Instead, people waited not in anticipation, but in resignation. They waited for the moment when this long night would finally give way, when the kingdom, exhausted from holding its breath, could exhale again. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. The final chapter was approaching, not with fanfare, not with ceremony, but with the slow, steady unraveling of a life, and the kingdom held rigid within its shadow. By the beginning of the year 1463, Frederick III's condition had crossed the final boundary where hope no longer lived. The swelling at his throat had grown so large that it occupied nearly the entire right side of his neck. The skin covering it had stretched thin, fragile like damp parchment, and along its surface appeared narrow fissures where the pressure from beneath forced its way outward. From those small openings, a cloudy fluid seeped continuously, soaking into his collars, then deeper into his bedding, until every layer of fabric in his chamber carried a scent that could not be washed away. Frederick himself had almost no sense of smell left, but anyone standing even several steps from the doorway struggled to breathe evenly. Every movement became a burden. Even the act of lifting his chin brought a constriction so sharp that his breath broke into uneven gasps. Sleep no longer resembled sleep. It resembled short collapses of consciousness, each lasting mere moments before he jolted awake in a panic, clawing at the pillows beneath him, as though he could somehow carve out more space for air. Those who passed his room at night whispered that they sometimes heard a soft rustling, followed by trembling sounds, faint scratches, muffled groans, and the brittle rasp of fingers brushing against taut skin. It was Frederick, attempting with trembling hands to press against the swelling, as if instinct alone urged him to free his throat from whatever was constricting it. Food had ceased to be part of his life entirely. Even the thinnest liquids, barely more than flavoured water, refused to travel down his throat. Each attempt brought them back up almost immediately, mixed with streaks of red and thickened saliva that pooled along the front of his nightclothes. His limbs grew thin and chilled, marked with bluish shadows that spread gradually along the skin. Yet the swelling at his neck continued to grow, creating a distorted contrast. A body weakening rapidly, and a single place where the illness seemed to gather all its force, expanding as though independent of him. The physicians, terrified by the consequences of any mistake, maintained a ritual of treatments that had long since abandoned any foundation in healing. They inserted small needles dipped in herbal mixtures. They warmed metal instruments over low flames and held them briefly near the skin, not to cut, but to follow the last traditions they knew, traditions meant to draw out illness through heat. They sprinkled powders crushed from bark and roots along the edges of the fissures, and whispered reassurances none of them believed. Nothing relieved Frederick's torment. Nothing even slowed it. The physicians did not persist out of faith. They persisted because not persisting meant facing consequences far more immediate than illness. Within that dim chamber, lit by candles that always seemed to flicker weakly no matter how many were added, the authority of an entire kingdom thinned alongside the king's breath. The walls were lined with cloths that had once been white, but had since absorbed too many days of damp air. The floorboards carried the imprint of countless footsteps, doctors, attendants, guards, all moving with the same subdued rhythm, as though even sound itself had become dangerous. Court life outside the room had taken on a strange stillness. No one raised their voices. No one discussed the future. The air felt as though it had settled into a deep winter, even when the season had long passed. Every advisor who visited the king did so reluctantly, stepping in slowly, keeping their hands clasped and their heads low. They spoke in brief sentences, careful not to let their tone suggest urgency, fear, or impatience, any of which could awaken Frederick's suspicion. They remained several feet from him, as though proximity itself might provoke another frantic struggle for air. In the silence, the illness became not only Frederick's burden, but the kingdom's shadow. His condition dictated the pace of governing. Letters went unanswered. Decisions were postponed. Alliances faltered. Even the servants moved as though they were part of a monastic ritual, their footsteps quiet, their gestures measured, all of them waiting for something they could not name aloud. What had begun years earlier as a private affliction had become an unavoidable presence in every corner of the palace. The king's weakening breath marked the rhythm of the realm itself, slow, strained, unpredictable. And by early spring, one truth had settled over everyone, from the lowest servant to the highest counselor. The final moment was no longer a question of if, but of when, and it approached with the slow inevitability of nightfall. On the night of the 14th of March, in the year 1463, Frederick's long struggle finally reached its breaking point. He woke abruptly from a brief collapse, his chest tightening as if an invisible weight had settled over his lungs. His body arched in an unnatural curve, every muscle drawn taut from the effort of trying to draw in air. His breathing fractured into short, jagged bursts, sounds that hovered somewhere between a muffled groan and air forcing its way through a narrow fissure. Thick moisture mixed with traces of blood seeped down his chest, darkening the linen in erratic streaks. He attempted to rise, but his legs no longer supported him. He slipped sideways, falling onto the cold stone floor, his head striking the corner of the bed frame. A dull stain bloomed across the tiles like a wilted flower. For a moment, he lay still, eyes unfocused, before instinct drove him to move again. He shifted to his hands and knees, slow, shaking, disoriented, dragging himself forward as though trying to escape the very body that was failing him from within. Each breath scraped through his throat in a thin, strained whistle, as if the air itself resisted entering. Beneath the skin of his neck, the swollen mass pulsed rhythmically. It rose with each desperate attempt to inhale, then sank sharply, tightening the remaining space in his airway. It gave the eerie impression of something expanding from within, pressing outward with a force that was both painful and suffocating. Outside the chamber, the servants stood in a rigid line along the corridor. None dared open the door. They understood all too well that, even on the edge of collapse, the king's temper could flare unpredictably. They remained frozen where they were, listening to the uneven thuds of his movements against the floor. The colour drained from Frederick's face, before returning in deep, unnatural shades, first a flushed crimson, then a bruised violet, then a muted grey. His features twisted with the raw struggle for air. His lips parted in an effort to release the pressure building in his chest, but only a thin foam appeared at the corner of his mouth, tinged with faint traces of red. His hands trembled violently. His fingers tightened and loosened without rhythm, as if searching for something to hold on to. His body shuddered again, shoulders lifting sharply, arms buckling under the strain. His head tilted downward, then jerked upward in a reflexive attempt to breathe more deeply, but nothing filled his lungs. Only the faintest whisper of air entered barely enough to sustain him for a heartbeat before slipping away again. His vision wavered. The edges of the room blurred, and the golden glow of the fire in the hearth fragmented into shifting shapes that swayed and dipped before his eyes. Another tremor passed through him, then another. His limbs moved without order, one arm pushing, one sliding, his legs dragging behind him in uneven motions. The stone beneath him grew slick with moisture, and his movements slowed, as though each attempt to lift his body required more strength than he possessed. His breaths shortened further, falling into a pattern of 2 shallow gasps, followed by long, harrowing pauses. By now, the servants at the door were silently crying, not out of affection, but from the suffocating tension that filled the air. They heard the strained breathing, the weak impacts of his hands against the floor, the rasping sound that echoed in the narrow corridor. Yet none stepped inside. Fear held them still, as firmly as chains. The fire crackled once, and then dimmed, as though bowing to the weight of the moment. Frederick's movements lessened, his body no longer arched, his fingers no longer curled, his breaths thinned into barely audible whispers. Then, in a final effort, his chest lifted once, twice, 3 times. On the third rise, his entire body trembled, and his eyes opened wide, unfocused and glassy. The rise did not come again. His hands relaxed against his throat. His gaze froze. The faint remnants of breath dissolved into the stillness of the chamber, and for the first time in many years, the room became quiet, truly quiet, without the sound of strained breathing or restless shuffling. Frederick III passed not in peace, but in a silence shaped by exhaustion, fear, and the long unravelling of a body that had fought itself until the very last moment. The moment Frederick III's chest rose for the final time, and then fell still, a different kind of silence settled over the chamber, one heavier than grief, heavier than fear. His body had barely been without breath for a single hour before the first signs of decay appeared, creeping outward from the very place where illness had tormented him for so many years. The swollen mass along his throat, long, inflamed and saturated with infection, began to seep into every layer of cloth beneath him. A mixture of old blood, stagnant fluid, and the residue of countless failed remedies soaked into his collar and into the sheets, turning the space around his bed into a cloud of suffocating staleness. Servants approached the chamber door cautiously, driven only by duty and the knowledge that ignoring the room entirely would bring more trouble later. Even with the heavy wooden windows pushed wide open and winter air spilling in, the scent that rose from the bed was thick enough to feel on the skin. It clung to the walls, to the floor, to the breath of anyone who stepped inside. No one spoke. Speech felt disrespectful, as though sound itself might disturb what remained of him. By the time dawn light filtered through the windows, Frederick's body had begun to swell. The change was subtle at first, a tautness in the skin, a rounding of the limbs, but it grew more pronounced with every minute. Areas along his neck and face darkened, shifting from the pallor of death into bruised shades of blue and purple. What had once been cracks in the skin, caused by months of inflammation, became thin lines leaking a pale, viscous fluid that seeped downward, staining the bedding in slow, deliberate trails. The servants tasked with tending to him hesitated at the threshold. None dared touch the body with bare hands. Even those with cloth coverings wrapped around their palms trembled. Eventually, wooden boards were brought in, makeshift tools meant to shift the weight of their late king without direct contact. They slid the boards beneath his shoulders and torso, working slowly, breath held, eyes averted from the distorted shape of his neck. Every movement seemed to release another wave of the suffocating odor, as though the illness itself resisted being moved. Outside the chamber, word of Frederick's passing spread, not through cries or formal announcements, but through the quiet stillness that travelled down the corridors. People did not mourn aloud. The king had ruled through fear for too long, and the palace had learned to survive by silence. Now, even in death, that silence persisted. Guards stood stiff at their posts, hands covering their faces without being told. Courtiers avoided one another's eyes, their expressions a mix of caution and fatigued disbelief. There were no hymns, no tolling bells, no prayers whispered for the soul of a monarch. The weight of his reign hung too heavily on the minds of those still living. Many had lost family, safety, or peace due to his years of suspicion. Others had survived only by withdrawing into the quietest corners of the palace, becoming shadows in order to avoid being noticed. Even now, with Frederick gone, the fear did not dissipate. It lingered like an echo, a memory carved too deeply to fade at once. Within the chamber, as servants arranged the body, the air felt colder than before. One of them muttered a brief apology, though to whom, none knew, perhaps to the man Frederick once had been, before illness consumed him. Another whispered a short prayer under their breath, not of mourning, but of release, a wish that the suffering that had twisted his mind and body had finally ended. By late morning, the decay had accelerated. The discoloration across his skin had grown darker. The swollen mass along his throat had collapsed inward in places, releasing more fluid that seeped across the linens. No one lingered longer than necessary. They stepped back, bowed their heads, and exited as quietly as they had entered, careful not to let the door slam or echo. In the halls outside, the mood was neither relief nor sorrow. It was something in between, a hesitation, a waiting. The king had passed, but his presence, or rather the damage he caused, remained woven into every stone. People walked as though the floor might shift beneath them, and though the body in the chamber no longer breathed, the fear that Frederick had cultivated for so many years stayed lodged in the palace like a splinter that would not be removed easily. By the end of the day, one truth had become clear to everyone. Frederick III was gone, but the shadow of his illness, his suspicion, and the silence he had forced upon the kingdom would linger long after his body was taken away. His death was not an ending. It was merely the next chapter in a story the entire realm had been compelled to endure, a story of power that decayed from within, and of people who learned to survive in the darkness left behind. The moment Frederick III's breath finally faded, a quiet, unnerving shift settled over the royal chambers. It happened so subtly that those standing nearby could not immediately grasp what they were witnessing. Yet within a few hours, a disturbing truth emerged. The monarch's body, long weakened by years of relentless illness, began changing far more quickly than anyone expected. The infection in his throat, the same unseen enemy that had tormented him for so many seasons, now seeped outward like a final echo of his suffering. The linens beneath his head grew damp with a mixture of fluids, and the heavy air in the room thickened into something oppressive, something that clung to the walls and refused to disperse, even when the servants threw open every window they could reach. The morning light revealed more. His features, once swollen by the illness, now appeared sunken as the skin loosened. Areas along his neck darkened to a deep, uneven shade, as if shadows had been painted directly onto his body. Nothing was dramatic or sudden. Everything happened quietly, steadily, with an eerie softness. as though the illness continued its course even after his final breath. Those assigned to tend to him approached only when absolutely necessary, masking their faces with cloth and gloves, not out of disrespect, but from an instinctive fear of the lingering sickness that had so thoroughly consumed him. No one dared touch his skin directly. They lifted him with layers of fabric and wooden panels, careful, deliberate, keeping their distance, even though they knew he could no longer harm anyone. Word spread through the palace corridors without a single shout or cry. There were no ceremonial bells, no solemn announcements, no grand mourning rites. Frederick III had not inspired the kind of affection that brought people to tears. Instead, a nearly tangible silence spread from chamber to chamber. Those who had survived his unpredictable moods, his anxious decrees, and the oppressive weight of his illness simply bowed their heads, not in sorrow, but in weary acknowledgement. For years they had lived beside fear, not loyalty, and now that fear lingered in the air like a fog that refused to lift. Even the guards, who stood rigid at their posts, kept their scarves pulled close to their faces. Passing servants exchanged brief glances, not of cruelty, but of exhaustion. The dread that had shaped their lives for so long still hovered around them, as if the walls themselves remembered every whispered rumor, every trembling step, every silent plea for safety. No one raised their voice. No one dared speak loudly enough for their own words to echo. It was as though the palace had grown used to whispering and hesitated to reclaim its natural volume. Hours after his passing, conversations turned from fear to pragmatism. The officials understood that the king's remains needed to be handled quickly, not just for ritual, but to free the palace from the last physical traces of the illness that had overshadowed every corner of royal life. Even so, no one could shake the sense that they were moving through a place burdened with memories too heavy to ignore. Those who had once walked these halls in bright clothing and laughter now stepped lightly, as if afraid to disturb something delicate and invisible. By midday, attendants had managed to move the body to a prepared chamber, though they worked slowly, with the constant hush of those who know their actions are necessary but unwelcome. The quiet spread outward to the outer courts, where nobles gathered not to grieve, but to reflect, some with relief, some with uncertainty, all with the recognition that an era marked by fear had finally ended. Yet the atmosphere remained tense, as though everyone feared that speaking too soon, breathing too deeply, or moving too freely might somehow undo the fragile peace beginning to settle. For Frederick III, death did not bring the kind of legacy many rulers hoped for. There were no tales of triumph, no memories of warmth, no songs written in his honor. His illness had shaped not just his final years, but the emotional landscape of an entire palace. Even in death, it left behind a presence, a quiet, lingering imprint that would not fade in a single day. And so, through the dim corridors where the air still held traces of medicine and old fear, the truth settled in. The king was gone, and yet the shadow of his suffering remained. For those still living within the stone walls of the palace, it would take time, long, slow, gentle time, before the silence finally eased enough for them to breathe freely again. The death of Frederick III did not bring the relief his kingdom quietly prayed for. Instead, it felt like the closing page of a long, dark chronicle, heavy, lingering, and saturated with an unease that would not fade. When his final breath passed, the courtiers instinctively exhaled, yet none of them felt truly free. The fear he had carved into the foundations of the palace remained like grooves in stone, impossible to smooth out. The last years of his rule had dismantled everything once considered solid. Laws twisted into instruments of retribution, royal ceremonies reshaped into strange performances, and daily life reduced to a wordless routine, governed entirely by dread. Villages that had suffered under his anxious commands still bore marks of quiet devastation, their hearths cold, long after the events that had emptied them. Nobles who witnessed his impulsive punishments continued to live with the memory that even a misplaced sound, an accidental cough, a hurried step, a glance misinterpreted, had once been enough to condemn someone. The palace existed like a structure recovering from a great storm, one whose damage could not be seen immediately, but was felt in the subtle trembling of every wall and every breath taken within them. What remained was not merely the absence of a king, but the residue of a reign where illness had overshadowed reason. Frederick had left the living, but the consequences of his decline stayed behind. In the years that followed, scholars looking back would agree on one thing. The country's deterioration had not come from external forces. It was not war, nor famine, nor invasion that had weakened the realm. What fractured it was something far more insidious. An inward decay, beginning with the body of the ruler himself, then spreading outward like ripples across still water. His ailment, once confined to his throat, eventually seeped into every institution, every tradition, every corner of the kingdom. It became clear, in hindsight, that the physical collapse of Frederick's health had been only the first step. The real destruction unfolded later. In the quiet ways, people changed their habits, softened their footsteps, lowered their voices, and trained themselves never to show emotion in front of the throne. Over time, these behaviors solidified into habits the palace struggled to unlearn. Even after the king's passing, many still hesitated before entering a room, unsure whether the air itself might hold the echo of one of his unpredictable moods. The countryside, too, carried its scars. Older villagers whispered about the season, when fear travelled faster than any messenger, when unexpected orders could reach even remote hamlets, altering lives in a single night. Travellers passing through these areas noticed the subdued atmosphere, the way conversations dropped to a hush whenever the past was mentioned. It was as if the entire realm had adopted a collective memory of walking on thin ice, afraid that the slightest disturbance might break the fragile balance. Within the palace, the echo of his final decree lingered, his command that all who lived or worked in the castle wear a band of black cloth around the neck for 1 full year. Though the king had departed, the order remained in effect, upheld more out of instinctive caution than respect. After all, no one could forget the years when disobedience, even imagined, had led to consequences no one dared speak of. So the black bands stayed, transforming hallways once filled with colour and ceremony into avenues of muted shadows. Those who tied the cloth around their throats did so with the same weary acceptance they had shown during his life. They understood, perhaps too well, that the decree was not an expression of mourning. It was a final imprint of Frederick's troubled rule, a gesture extending the influence of his fear-driven decisions beyond the grave. The bands were less a tribute than a reminder, a symbol of how deeply his illness had reshaped the court and the rhythm of the kingdom itself. As days passed into weeks, and weeks into months, a strange quiet settled over the realm. It was not a peaceful quiet, but the aftermath of years spent bracing for unpredictable storms. The corridors still carried faint traces of the medicinal scents once poured endlessly into the king's chambers, mingling with the ever-present memory of sickness. Those who worked in the palace moved carefully around former servants of the king, each person burdened by recollections they did not share out loud. From the high windows, the strips of black cloth fluttered gently in the breeze, like whispered remnants of an era finally, painfully over. They marked not just the end of a reign, but the closing of a chapter where a single illness had reshaped an entire nation's destiny. And though Frederick III was no longer present, the lesson of his final years remained etched in the consciousness of all who survived him. Sometimes the downfall of a kingdom begins not with armies or enemies, but with the slow, quiet unravelling of the one who leads it.